Officer, that's...
A federal judge? Right. I got a tip you're here to pick up a bribe. Cash for a city contract.
The Saturday morning sun cast a warm, golden glow across the manicured lawns of Oak Creek Estates, an enclave of stately homes where the whisper of sprinkler systems was often the loudest sound to break the peace. Inside the open garage of a handsome two-story brick colonial, federal judge Marcus Thorne was lost in his own world. At 52, Thorne was a man who commanded respect in the courtroom, known for his sharp legal mind and an even-keeled temperament that could diffuse the most volatile legal battles. But here, in his sanctuary, he wasn't Judge Thorne of the United States District Court. He was just Marcus, a man in his element, wearing a grease-stained t-shirt and worn-out jeans, meticulously working on the engine of his prized 1968 Ford Mustang. The classic car, a project he had inherited from his father, was his therapy, a tangible connection to a simpler time. The scent of motor oil and metal polish hung in the air, a perfume of pure contentment. He had spent the last 2 hours carefully tuning the carburetor, his long, skilled fingers moving with a surgeon's precision. The rhythmic clinking of his wrench against the engine block was a familiar and soothing melody. He had a challenging week of hearings ahead, including a complex zoning dispute involving the city's controversial new waterfront development project. But for now, that world of gavels and legal briefs felt a million miles away. His wife, Sarah, had just brought him a steaming mug of coffee which sat on a nearby workbench, its warmth a small promise of a break he would take soon. He smiled to himself, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for this simple, peaceful moment. Life was good. He had built a career on the foundations of law and order, and he lived in a community that seemed to embody that very ideal. That sense of peace was shattered in an instant. The serene morning quiet was pierced by the sharp, aggressive growl of a police cruiser pulling into his driveway. It didn't just pull in, it screeched to a halt, its tires crunching loudly on the gravel, stopping just inches from the meticulously sculpted hedges bordering his property. The sudden intrusion was so jarring that Marcus dropped his wrench, which clattered loudly on the concrete floor. He straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag, a knot of confusion tightening in his stomach. Police rarely came through Oak Creek unless it was for a minor traffic stop on the main boulevard. He had lived here for 15 years and had never seen a patrol car in his own driveway. His first thought was that there might have been an accident down the street, or perhaps a neighbor had a medical emergency. He stepped out from under the raised hood of the Mustang, squinting against the bright sunlight. The officer who emerged from the driver's side was young, probably in his late 20s, with a short military-style haircut and a stiff, almost confrontational posture. His hand rested on the grip of his service weapon as he scanned the property, his eyes sweeping over the expensive home, the luxury SUV parked near the garage, and finally settling on Marcus with an expression of cold, immediate suspicion. There was no friendly wave, no reassuring nod, just a hard, analytical stare that felt entirely out of place on this tranquil Saturday morning. Marcus felt a familiar, unwelcome chill crawl up his spine, a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades, a ghost from a past he thought he had left far behind. He took a half-step forward, preparing to ask if he could help, but the officer's body language screamed that he wasn't here to ask for directions. The officer, whose name tag read K. Riley, unclipped his radio from his shoulder. His voice was flat and devoid of any courtesy as he spoke into it. "Dispatch, this is 3 Adam 15. I'm on scene at 112 Willow Lane. I have eyes on a potential suspect matching the description. Black male, casual clothing. Appears to be tampering with a vehicle in the driveway." Marcus's blood ran cold. Suspect? Tampering? He was standing in his own garage, working on his own car, at his own home. The absurdity of the statement was so profound, it almost felt like a scene from a poorly written movie. But the cold, unwavering glare from Officer Riley was very real. The officer clicked his radio back onto his uniform and began to walk toward Marcus, his steps slow and deliberate, each footfall on the driveway sounding like a drumbeat signaling the end of his peaceful morning and the beginning of a nightmare. The foundation of the orderly world Judge Marcus Thorne had built his life upon was about to crack wide open. As Officer Kevin Riley approached, Marcus Thorne made a conscious effort to remain perfectly still, his hands visible at his sides. He knew the choreography of these encounters all too well, not just from the cases he presided over, but from a lifetime of being a black man in America. He understood that in this moment, his title and his standing in the community were invisible. To the officer advancing on him, he was nothing more than the sum of a dispatcher's vague description: a suspect. He met the officer's gaze with a calm, neutral expression, determined not to give him any perceived reason to escalate the situation. The air between them crackled with an unspoken tension, the beautiful Saturday morning now feeling heavy and oppressive. "Can I help you, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice steady and respectful, the same tone he used to address lawyers in his courtroom. Officer Riley stopped about 10 feet away, maintaining a tactical distance. He didn't answer the question directly. Instead, his eyes darted from Marcus's grease-stained hands to the expensive tools laid out neatly on a towel, then back to Marcus's face. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. The question wasn't an inquiry, it was an accusation. "I'm working on my car," Marcus replied simply, gesturing with a slight nod toward the Mustang. "This is my home." Riley let out a short, incredulous huff of air that wasn't quite a laugh, but was loaded with dismissive contempt. "Your home? Right. I got a call about a suspicious individual casing the neighborhood, looking for opportunities. Said he was messing with a car in a driveway. And here you are." He made a sweeping gesture that encompassed Marcus and the garage. "Seems to fit the bill perfectly." The sheer arrogance of the officer was breathtaking. Marcus took a slow breath, reminding himself that losing his composure would only make things worse. "Officer, I can assure you there has been a misunderstanding. I am the owner of this property. My name is Marcus Thorne. I've lived here for 15 years. "Anyone can say that," Riley shot back instantly, his voice laced with a venom that seemed entirely unprovoked. "You got any ID on you? Something that proves you're not just some thief who broke into this garage?" "Of course," Marcus said, trying to infuse his voice with a cooperative tone. "My wallet is in the house, on the kitchen counter. If you'll allow me, I'll go get it." He made a slight, almost imperceptible move toward the door leading from the garage into the house. "Stay right where you are," Riley commanded, his hand moving from resting on his weapon to gripping it firmly. "Don't you move an inch. You think I'm stupid? Let you go inside where you could grab a weapon?" The situation was spiraling into absurdity. Marcus was being treated like a hardened criminal in his own home. "Officer," he said, his voice now taking on a firmer, more authoritative edge, the judge within him beginning to surface. "I am not a threat to you. I am simply trying to comply with your request for identification. I am telling you my wallet is right inside that door." "And I'm telling you to stay put," Riley repeated, his jaw tightening. He seemed to be enjoying the power dynamic, the control he wielded over a man who, in any other context, held a position of significant authority. "What's your name again?" "Marcus Thorne." Riley's lip curled into a smirk. He seemed to find the name amusing. "Well, Marcus, unless you can magically produce some identification that proves you live in this $1,000,000 house while wearing those rags, I'm going to have a hard time believing your story." The reference to his clothes, his old, comfortable weekend attire, was a clear dog whistle. It was the oldest, most tired stereotype in the book, the assumption that a black man in casual wear couldn't possibly belong in a place of affluence. At that moment, Sarah, Marcus's wife, opened the kitchen door holding a fresh glass of iced tea. She saw the police officer, the tension in her husband's stance, and the officer's hand on his gun. Her face went pale with fear. "Marcus, is everything all right?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Stay inside, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice a calm command that belied the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Everything is fine. The officer and I are just having a conversation." Riley's eyes flicked to Sarah, a white woman standing in the doorway of the expensive home, and for a fleeting second, a flicker of confusion crossed his face. But it was quickly replaced by a renewed wave of suspicion, as if he was already weaving a new, more sinister narrative in his mind. He looked back at Marcus, his eyes narrowed. "I'm going to ask you one more time. Who are you and what are you doing here?" he asked, as if the last 5 minutes of conversation had never happened. The officer wasn't seeking information, he was seeking confrontation. And Marcus Thorne was beginning to realize that no matter what he said or did, this officer had already decided he was guilty. The only question was, guilty of what? Seeing his wife's terrified face in the doorway solidified Marcus's resolve. This had to end, and it had to end now. The simmering injustice he felt began to boil over, but he forced it down, channeling it into a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't just a random stop anymore. It was a targeted harassment on his own property. "Officer Riley," Marcus said, his tone shifting from cooperative to commanding. He used the officer's name deliberately, a subtle reminder that he was not just an anonymous authority figure. "My wife is inside. She can bring my wallet out to you. It contains my driver's license, which shows this address, 112 Willow Lane. It also contains my judicial identification. I am a federal judge for this district." He delivered this last piece of information matter-of-factly, without a hint of arrogance, hoping it would act as a circuit breaker to the officer's escalating aggression. He expected a moment of shock, perhaps a dawning realization of the colossal mistake being made. Instead, Officer Riley threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, derisive sound that echoed in the quiet garage, a sound of pure disbelief and mockery. "A federal judge? You? Dressed like that?" He gestured dismissively at Marcus's grease-stained shirt. "That's a good one. I'll give you points for creativity. You think throwing out a fake title is going to scare me off? I've heard it all before. I once had a guy tell me he was the damn president." The blatant disrespect was staggering. Marcus had presided over cases involving some of the most dangerous criminals in the state, and he had never been shown such utter contempt. "It's not a fake title, officer. My judicial ID is in my wallet. Please just allow my wife to bring it to you." "Sarah, go inside and lock the door," Marcus called over his shoulder, his voice firm. He didn't want her any closer to this volatile situation. She hesitated, her eyes wide with fear before retreating inside, the click of the deadbolt echoing softly. Riley's smirk widened. "See? Now your wife is hiding, getting your stories straight? Let me tell you what I think is going on here." He took a step closer, invading Marcus's personal space. "I think you're exactly who the caller said you were, a criminal. But you're not just some petty thief looking to steal a car radio. No, this house, this neighborhood, this is big time." Marcus stared at him, bewildered. "What are you talking about?" And then Officer Riley delivered the line that would detonate his own career and send shockwaves through the entire city. The call wasn't just about a suspicious person, it was a specific tip. It said a man matching your description was here to pick up a bribe, a cash payment, in exchange for a favorable ruling on a big city contract. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Bribery? It was the most ludicrous, baseless accusation imaginable. In his entire career, Marcus Thorne's integrity had been beyond reproach. He was known for being scrupulously fair, almost to a fault. The idea that he would be involved in something so sordid was not just false, it was an insult to the very core of his being. He was so stunned that for a moment he couldn't speak. He just stared at the young officer, trying to process the poison he was spewing. "A bribe?" Marcus finally managed to say, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "That is the most outrageously false statement I have ever heard. On what possible grounds are you making such an accusation?" The anonymous tip was very specific, Riley said, his confidence swelling. He was no longer just a patrol officer on a routine call. In his mind, he was a hero about to take down a corrupt official. He had found the narrative he wanted, and he was clinging to it with fanatical certainty. "Said the cash would be left for you in the vehicle, in that classic piece of junk right there." He pointed a thumb at the Mustang. Said you'd be here on a Saturday morning pretending to work on it, as the perfect cover. Looks like I got here just in time. It was a perfectly constructed lie, a fantasy woven from pure malice and prejudice. There was no cash, no bribe, no conspiracy. There was only a man, his car, and a police officer with a dangerously vivid imagination. The specificity of the accusation, the car, the Saturday morning, was chilling. This wasn't just a random act of racial profiling anymore. It felt targeted. It felt personal. "Officer, you are making a catastrophic mistake," Marcus said, his voice resonating with the full weight of his judicial authority. "You are manufacturing a federal crime out of thin air. You have no evidence, no probable cause, and you are acting on an anonymous tip that is clearly a malicious fabrication. I am ordering you to cease this line of questioning. Call your supervisor to the scene and step off my property." Riley's face hardened. He saw the judge's command not as a warning, but as a challenge. "Ordering me?" he sneered. "You're in no position to order anyone. In fact, based on your refusal to cooperate and the evidence at hand, I believe I have everything I need." He reached for his hip, but this time he didn't grab his gun. He unclipped his handcuffs. "Marcus Thorne," he said, the name dripping with sarcasm. "You are under arrest for suspicion of bribery and conspiracy to commit fraud." The metallic click of the handcuffs opening sent a jolt of ice-cold disbelief through Marcus Thorne's body. For a split second, his mind refused to accept what was happening. He was a federal judge, a pillar of the legal system, and he was about to be shackled in his own driveway like a common criminal based on a fantasy concocted by a rogue patrol officer. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. This wasn't just an arrest, it was a public degradation. "Don't do this, officer," Marcus said, his voice low and steady, a final appeal to whatever sliver of reason might still exist in the young man's mind. "You are crossing a line from which there is no return. You are violating my civil rights, and you are committing a grave error that will have severe consequences." "The only one facing consequences here is you, Your Honor," Riley spat back, his eyes gleaming with a manic self-righteousness. He clearly believed he was the hero of this story, unmasking a corrupt official hiding in plain sight. He lunged forward, grabbing Marcus's left wrist with a rough, practiced motion. The cold steel of the handcuff clamped around his skin. At that moment, the commotion in the driveway had finally drawn the attention of the neighbors. Mrs. Gable, a retired schoolteacher who had lived next door for 20 years, was tending to her rose bushes. She looked up, her face a mask of confusion. A few houses down, David Chen, a software engineer, was getting his mail and paused, his brow furrowed. They saw the police car, the aggressive officer, and the unbelievable sight of their distinguished, quiet neighbor, Judge Thorne, being placed in handcuffs. "Officer, what on earth is going on?" Mrs. Gable called out, her voice quavering with concern as she hurried to the edge of her lawn. "That's Judge Thorne! He lives here! What are you doing?" Riley shot her a dismissive glance over his shoulder. "Ma'am, please stay back. This is official police business. This man is under investigation for serious felonies." "Felonies?" David Chen shouted from his driveway, now pulling out his phone. "That's ridiculous! I've known him for years! There's been a mistake!" The sight of the phone camera seemed to fuel Riley's arrogance rather than temper it. He yanked Marcus's other arm behind his back with unnecessary force, causing a sharp pain to shoot through Marcus's shoulder. He cinched the second cuff tightly, the metal biting into Marcus's flesh. "There's no mistake," Riley announced loudly, playing to the small but growing audience. "Turns out your respectable neighbor isn't who you think he is." Marcus stood there, stripped of his dignity, his hands bound behind his back, the familiar scent of motor oil on his skin now mingling with the cold, alien smell of police-issue steel. He could see more neighbors peering out their windows, doors creaking open. The entire peaceful tapestry of his life was being torn to shreds in front of the very community where he had built his reputation. He felt a burning shame, irrational but overwhelming. He had done nothing wrong, yet he felt exposed, branded. Riley shoved him forward toward the patrol car. "Let's go. You can tell your story to the detectives downtown." As he was being marched down his own driveway, Marcus saw his wife Sarah's face appear in the bay window of their living room. Her expression was one of pure, unadulterated horror. Their eyes met, and in that moment, he felt a surge of protective anger that momentarily eclipsed his own humiliation. This wasn't just an attack on him, it was an attack on his family, on the life they had built together. He straightened his back, held his head high, and walked with a defiant dignity that seemed to infuriate Riley even more. "You have the right to remain silent," Riley began, reciting the Miranda rights in a bored, monotone voice as he pushed Marcus against the side of the hot patrol car to pat him down. The recitation was a surreal soundtrack to the destruction of his morning, his reputation, and his faith in the system he had sworn to uphold. Each word was a drop of acid, burning away the notion that his position or his character could protect him from the raw, arbitrary power of a man with a badge and a prejudice. As David Chen and two other neighbors recorded the entire scene on their phones, Officer Riley shoved the federal judge into the back of the police cruiser. The door slammed shut, a final, definitive sound that sealed the injustice. Through the reinforced glass, Marcus Thorne watched his beautiful home, his beloved car, and his quiet, orderly life recede as the cruiser pulled away. Its sirens silent, but its presence screaming a lie to the entire neighborhood. The nightmare had just begun, and the world was watching. The sterile, impersonal environment of the city's central police precinct was a world away from the sun-drenched tranquility of Oak Creek Estates. Judge Marcus Thorne sat in a small, windowless interrogation room, the handcuffs finally removed, but the phantom weight of them still lingering on his wrists. The cheap plastic chair was uncomfortable, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. For 2 hours, he had been left completely alone, a deliberate tactic designed to disorient and intimidate. But Marcus wasn't a common suspect. He was a man who had spent a career studying the very system that now held him captive. He used the time not to panic, but to process, to analyze, to prepare. He replayed every moment of the encounter with Officer Riley, cataloging the officer's words, his actions, and the clear constitutional violations. Finally, the door opened. A man in his late 50s entered, his face etched with the weary lines of a long career. He wore a rumpled suit, not a uniform, and his movements were slow and deliberate. He introduced himself as Detective Frank Harding, a 30-year veteran of the force. Unlike Riley, there was no fire in his eyes, only a deep, profound exhaustion. He sat down opposite Marcus, placing a thin file folder on the metal table between them. "Judge Thorne," Harding began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't use air quotes or a sarcastic tone. He said the title with a matter-of-fact respect that was the first sign of professionalism Marcus had seen all day. "I've read Officer Riley's preliminary report. I've also been made aware of your position on the federal bench. We have a situation here." "A situation, Detective?" Marcus replied, his voice calm and measured. "I was assaulted, unlawfully detained, and falsely arrested on my own property in front of my family and neighbors. I would call that more than a situation. I would call it a criminal act perpetrated by one of your officers." Harding nodded slowly, not disputing the claim. He opened the file, his eyes scanning the single sheet of paper inside. "Riley's report is based on an anonymous tip phoned into the dispatch center. The tip alleged that a federal judge was accepting a cash bribe related to a city development contract, and that the exchange was to take place this morning at your residence, disguised as work on a vintage car." He looked up from the paper, his gaze direct. "The report is thin, extraordinarily thin. It lists no surveillance, no corroborating evidence, nothing but the word of an anonymous caller." "Because there is nothing else, Detective," Marcus stated. "It's a complete fabrication." "I'm inclined to believe you," Harding said, surprising Marcus with his candor. I've been a cop for 30 years. I know what a real bribery investigation looks like. It involves months of surveillance by the FBI, wiretaps, marked bills. It doesn't start with a single patrol officer responding to a vague tip and making a felony arrest in under 10 minutes. It stinks. The whole thing stinks to high heaven. This was the first glimmer of hope Marcus had felt since the cruiser door slammed shut. He was speaking to a real cop, a man who understood procedure and, more importantly, recognized the absence of it. Officer Riley refused to look at my identification. He laughed when I told him who I was. He was not interested in the truth. He had a narrative in his head, and he was determined to make reality fit it. Harding sighed, running a hand over his tired face. Kevin Riley. He's young, ambitious, thinks every call is his chance to be a hero and make a big bust. He's got a history of aggressive stops, particularly in affluent neighborhoods. A number of complaints, all of them dismissed internally as unfounded. The detective's eyes held a flicker of shame, an acknowledgement of the system's failure to police its own. But this is a new level. Accusing a sitting federal judge of bribery? That's not just aggressive, that's either insane or something else. That something else hung in the air between them. The idea that this wasn't just a random act of a power-hungry cop, but something more deliberate, more orchestrated. Harding leaned forward, lowering his voice. Judge, off the record, this arrest is a disaster for the department. The brass is already in panic mode. What I need to know is there any reason someone would want to target you? This specific accusation, bribery connected to a city contract, does that ring any bells? The question hit Marcus like a lightning bolt. The waterfront development project. It was the big contentious case on his docket for the upcoming week. A multi-billion-dollar deal, championed by the mayor's office, but facing fierce opposition from community groups and environmental activists over zoning and bidding irregularities. He was scheduled to hear arguments on an injunction that could halt the entire project indefinitely. If that injunction were granted, it would be a massive financial and political blow to some very powerful people, including the mayor himself. Yes, Detective, Marcus said slowly, the pieces of a dark and complex puzzle beginning to click into place. It rings a very loud bell. Before Harding could respond, the interrogation room door swung open again. A young, uniformed officer stood in the doorway, his face pale. Detective, you need to come see this. It's everywhere. The news, the internet. It's gone viral. Harding and Marcus exchanged a look. The battle had just moved from the confines of this small room to the court of public opinion. Detective Harding followed the young officer out into the main bullpen of the detective squad, with Marcus just a few steps behind. The usually chaotic hum of the office had been replaced by a tense, focused silence. Every eye was glued to a computer monitor or a television screen mounted on the wall. On every screen, the same scene was playing out on a loop. The clear, damning footage from David Chen's smartphone. It showed Officer Riley's aggressive posture, his hand on Judge Thorne's arm. It captured the judge's calm, dignified protests and the neighbors' shocked cries. The audio was crystal clear, broadcasting Riley's sneering dismissal of Mrs. Gable and his loud, baseless accusation for the entire world to hear. But the money shot, the image that was already becoming an iconic symbol of injustice, was the moment the handcuffs clicked shut on the wrists of the distinguished graying man in the grease-stained T-shirt. It hit Twitter 20 minutes ago, the young officer stammered. The hashtag #Justice for Thorne is already the #1 trend in the country. CNN and Fox News are both cutting into their regular programming to cover it. Harding stared at the screen, his face grim. He had seen departmental crises before, but this was a nuclear bomb. The video left no room for ambiguity, no space for the usual police union spin. It was a raw, unfiltered depiction of an abuse of power. He knew with absolute certainty that Officer Kevin Riley's career was over. The only question now was how much collateral damage he would take with him. Just then, A woman with a sharp suit and an even sharper expression strode into the precinct as if she owned it. She was flanked by 2 associates carrying briefcases. She exuded an aura of such intense, focused power that even the seasoned detectives paused to watch her pass. "I am Eleanor Vance," she announced to the front desk sergeant, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere like a diamond blade. "I am counsel for Judge Marcus Thorne. He is being held here illegally. I want him released immediately." Eleanor Vance was more than just a lawyer. She was a legend in civil rights litigation. A legal titan known for dismantling corrupt police departments and winning record-setting settlements for her clients. Her arrival was like calling in an airstrike. Harding knew that any hope the department had of containing this situation had just vanished. "Ms. Vance," Harding said, approaching her. "Detective Frank Harding. Your client is with me. We're in the process of clearing this up." "The process is over, Detective," Vance said, her eyes cold. "My client will not answer any more questions. He will not be part of your internal clearing up. He is a victim of a malicious arrest and a kidnapping under the color of law. You will release him to my custody now, or my next call will be to the U.S. Attorney's Office to file federal charges against every officer involved in this fiasco, starting with Officer Riley and ending with your police chief." There was no bluff in her voice. Harding nodded. "This way," he said, leading her toward the interrogation room where he had left Marcus. The reunion between Marcus and his lawyer was brief and professional. She quickly assessed his condition, noting the red marks on his wrists. "Document everything," she said quietly. "We'll have a doctor examine you as soon as we're out of here." Within 15 minutes, Marcus Thorne walked out of the police precinct, a free man. But as he stepped outside into the glare of the afternoon sun, he was met with a scene of chaos. A swarm of news vans and reporters had descended upon the building, their cameras and microphones creating a thicket of media. Shouts of, "Judge, can you give us a comment?" and "What happened this morning?" filled the air. Eleanor Vance stepped in front of him, shielding him from the onslaught. She raised a hand for quiet, and the clamor immediately subsided. She was a master of the press, and she knew this was a critical moment. This morning, Judge Marcus Thorne, a respected member of the federal judiciary, was the victim of a shocking and unconstitutional abuse of power, she began, her voice ringing with conviction. He was falsely arrested at his home, in front of his family, based on a ludicrous and unsubstantiated claim. The video you have all seen speaks for itself. It is a terrifying portrait of what happens when prejudice is armed with a badge and a gun. We will be pursuing every available legal remedy to hold the officer involved and the department that employs him accountable. This was not just an attack on one man, it was an attack on the rule of law itself. We will have no further comment at this time. With that, she guided Marcus through the media scrum to a waiting black car. As they pulled away, Marcus looked out the window at the chaos he was leaving behind. His personal nightmare had become a national headline. The video had ignited a firestorm, and public outrage was growing by the second. People across the country were watching the footage, their anger fueled by the raw injustice of the scene. The story was no longer just about him. It had become a symbol of a deeper, more painful truth about the country. And in the mayor's office downtown, a man in a perfectly tailored suit was watching the same news coverage, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He had set a fire, and now it was threatening to burn down his entire kingdom. Mayor Richard Sterling watched the news report on the large television in his polished mahogany office, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his desk. At 39, Sterling was the charismatic golden boy mayor, lauded for his sharp suits, silver-tongued speeches, and a carefully crafted image of a modern, progressive leader. He had risen to power on a promise of transparency and reform. But behind the public facade was a man driven by a ravenous ambition and a chillingly pragmatic approach to power. He saw the law not as a set of principles, but as a collection of obstacles to be navigated or, when necessary, dismantled. The viral video of Judge Thorne's arrest was not just a PR crisis. It was a loose thread that could unravel his entire career. He had spent the last hour in a series of frantic, hushed phone calls with his chief of staff and the police chief, a man he had hand-picked for his loyalty rather than his competence. The plan had been simple, elegant in its brutality. Use a hot-headed, easily manipulated patrol officer like Riley to put a scare into Judge Thorne. The baseless bribery accusation, fed to Riley through a carefully laundered, anonymous tip, was meant to be a warning shot, a piece of manufactured mud that would taint the judge's reputation and perhaps force him to recuse himself from the waterfront development case. It was never supposed to end in a public, on-camera arrest. It was supposed to be a quiet, intimidating conversation, a seed of doubt planted. But Riley, in his arrogant stupidity, had gone nuclear. "Get me a press conference ready. 45 minutes, Sterling barked into his phone to his press secretary. "Main hall. I'll address this personally." He hung up and straightened his tie, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened TV screen. The panic he felt was real, but years of political maneuvering had taught him how to mask it behind a veneer of calm authority. He would get ahead of this. He would control the narrative. 45 minutes later, Mayor Sterling stood at a podium, flanked by the police chief, who looked pale and deeply uncomfortable. The room was packed with journalists, the air buzzing with anticipation. Sterling leaned into the microphone, his expression a carefully rehearsed mask of solemn concern. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice resonating with practiced sincerity. "Like all of you, I was shocked and deeply disturbed by the video I saw this morning involving Judge Marcus Thorne. The footage is difficult to watch, and it raises serious questions that demand immediate and transparent answers." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Let me be perfectly clear. Racism and abuse of power have absolutely no place in our city, and they will not be tolerated within our police department. Not on my watch." He announced that Officer Kevin Riley had been suspended without pay, pending the outcome of a full and thorough investigation by the department's Internal Affairs Division. He promised that this investigation would be swift, impartial, and that the results would be made public. It was a masterclass in political crisis management. He condemned the act while appearing to defend the integrity of the institution. He sacrificed the pawn, Officer Riley, to protect the more valuable pieces on the board, namely himself. "I have spoken personally with Judge Thorne to convey my profound apology on behalf of the entire city," Sterling lied smoothly, his eyes looking directly into the cameras. "I assured him that we will take every necessary step to rectify this terrible injustice and to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again." This was a calculated falsehood designed to paint him as a compassionate leader taking decisive action. In reality, his office had been stonewalling Eleanor Vance's calls all afternoon. He continued, weaving a narrative of a single bad apple whose actions did not reflect the values of the dedicated men and women of the police force. He spoke of new training initiatives, community outreach programs, and his unwavering commitment to building trust between the police and the communities they serve. He was calm, reassuring, and utterly deceptive. To the average viewer watching at home, he was the picture of a mayor in control, a leader horrified by injustice and determined to root it out. He was taking all the right steps, saying all the right words. But for those who knew where to look, the cracks in his performance were visible. He never once mentioned the specific, bizarre nature of the bribery accusation. He framed the incident solely as a case of racial bias, a serious issue to be sure, but one that conveniently diverted attention away from the more sinister question. Why was Judge Thorne targeted with such a specific and malicious lie? It was a deliberate omission, a sleight of hand designed to keep the focus on the patrol officer and away from the source of the poison. As he finished his speech and took a few carefully selected questions, Sterling felt a sense of relief. He had weathered the initial storm. He had thrown Riley to the wolves and positioned himself as the champion of reform. He believed he could contain the fallout, manage the narrative, and let the public's outrage burn itself out. As he walked away from the podium, he allowed himself a small, private smile. It was a dangerous game, but he was confident he could still win. He had underestimated Judge Thorne's resilience and Officer Riley's incompetence, but he would not underestimate his own ability to manipulate the truth. He was the mayor, after all, and in his city, power was the ultimate truth. In the week following the arrest, the firestorm showed no signs of abating. The video of Judge Thorne's humiliation was a permanent fixture on news cycles and social media feeds. Protests erupted outside City Hall and police headquarters, with citizens of all races demanding accountability that went far beyond the suspension of a single officer. The name Kevin Riley became a national symbol of police misconduct. For Mayor Richard Sterling, the crisis was spinning out of his control. The simple narrative of a bad apple was not holding. Journalists and commentators began asking the question he had desperately tried to avoid. Where did the absurd bribery allegation come from? The pressure was immense, and the city's legal department knew they were facing a lawsuit of catastrophic proportions. Eleanor Vance had already filed a preliminary notice of claim, signaling her intent to sue for civil rights violations, false arrest, malicious prosecution, and defamation. The potential liability was not just financial. A protracted legal battle would mean depositions, discovery, and the public airing of the police department's dirty laundry, a risk Sterling could not afford, especially with the waterfront development deal hanging in the balance. He needed this to go away, quickly and quietly. He gave his city attorneys a single, clear directive. Settle it, whatever it takes. 2 weeks after the arrest, Eleanor Vance received a call. It was the city's lead counsel. After a few minutes of perfunctory legal jargon, the offer was laid on the table. The city was prepared to offer Judge Thorne a settlement of $900,000. It was a massive sum, one of the largest pre-litigation offers the city had ever made. Along with the money, the city offered a formal written apology from the mayor's office and the police department, and they would officially expunge the arrest record. There was, however, one crucial condition. The settlement would include a strict non-disclosure and non-disparagement clause. In short, Marcus Thorne would have to agree to never speak publicly about the incident or the investigation again. It was a high-priced gag order. It was an attempt to buy his silence. Vance convened a meeting in the conference room of her downtown law office. Marcus and his wife Sarah sat on one side of the large table, Vance on the other. She laid out the terms of the offer dispassionately, explaining the legal ramifications. "It's a strong offer, Marcus," she said, her tone neutral. "Financially, it's likely more than we would get even if we went to trial and won. It's a clear admission of guilt on their part. Taking it would mean this is all over. You get the money, the apology, and you can begin to put this nightmare behind you. No depositions, no trial, no reliving that day over and over again for the next 2 years." Sarah reached over and took her husband's hand. She looked exhausted, the stress of the past 2 weeks having taken a visible toll. "Maybe we should take it, honey," she said softly. "I just want our life back. I want the news vans gone from our street. I want to feel safe in our own home again. This money, it could mean you could retire early. We could travel. We could just be done with all of this." Marcus listened, his face an unreadable mask. He looked at his wife's tired face and felt a powerful urge to agree, to take the easy way out and retreat back into the quiet life they had built. $900,000 was life-changing money. It was an acknowledgement of the wrong they had done to him. But as he sat there, he thought about Officer Riley's sneering laugh. He thought about the cold steel of the handcuffs on his wrists. And most importantly, he thought about the lie, the bizarre, specific, and poisonous lie about bribery. The city's offer would punish the officer, but it would bury the truth. It would leave the most important question unanswered. Who planted that lie and why? Accepting the money would mean letting that person, the true architect of his humiliation, get away with it. It would mean becoming a willing participant in the cover-up. He had dedicated his life to the pursuit of truth and justice. He couldn't abandon those principles now, not even for peace, not even for nearly $1 million. He squeezed Sarah's hand and looked at his lawyer. "Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "what does your gut tell you?" A slow smile spread across Eleanor Vance's face. She had been testing him, and he had given her the answer she was hoping for. "My gut tells me they're not just paying for a false arrest," she said. "They're paying to bury something. An offer this high, this fast. It's not just an apology, it's panic money. They are terrified of what we'll find if we start digging." Marcus nodded, a new sense of purpose hardening his resolve. "Then let's start digging," he said. "Tell the city we reject their offer. We're not interested in their money. We're interested in the truth. We're going to trial." The decision was made. It was a declaration of war. By turning down the $900,000, Marcus Thorne was no longer just a victim seeking compensation. He was an adversary on a quest for the whole truth, and he had just signaled to Mayor Sterling that this scandal was not going to be easily buried. The real fight was just beginning. Rejecting the city's settlement offer was like kicking over a hornet's nest. The city's attorneys, accustomed to victims eagerly accepting large payouts, were stunned. Mayor Sterling was furious. The rejection meant one thing: discovery. Eleanor Vance and her team now had the legal authority to demand documents, emails, personnel files, and sworn testimony from the city and the police department. The protective walls the administration had tried to erect were about to be systematically torn down. The first target was Officer Kevin Riley. Vance's team filed a sweeping subpoena for his entire service record. What they received was a heavily redacted file, but even with the blacked-out sections, a disturbing picture began to emerge. In just 5 years on the force, Riley had amassed 12 citizen complaints. 8 of them were for excessive force, and 4 were for improper stops and searches. All 12 complaints had been filed by minority citizens, and all 12 had been dismissed by Internal Affairs with the same boilerplate language. Exonerated. Actions found to be within departmental policy. Vance's lead investigator, a retired but relentless detective named Ben Carter, wasn't satisfied. He knew that official records only told part of the story. He spent weeks on the streets, tracking down the individuals who had filed those complaints. He found a young black college student who Riley had thrown against a wall for walking suspiciously near the university campus. He found a Hispanic business owner who Riley had detained for over an hour, searching his vehicle without cause after a minor traffic violation. He found a pattern. Riley had a habit of targeting people of color in affluent, predominantly white neighborhoods, people he deemed out of place. He was a predator who used his badge to hunt on the basis of skin color. This evidence was damning. It established a clear history of racial bias that would destroy Riley's credibility on the witness stand. It proved that the stop of Judge Thorne was not an isolated incident, but part of a consistent pattern of malicious behavior. It also demonstrated that the police department's internal disciplinary system was a sham, designed to protect problem officers rather than remove them. This was a huge victory for their civil case, but for Marcus Thorne, it wasn't enough. While the evidence explained the who and the how of the initial stop, it still didn't explain the why. Why the bizarre, out-of-the-blue accusation of bribery? Riley's other victims had been accused of resisting arrest, possessing drugs, or other common street-level offenses. None had been accused of a complex white-collar crime. The bribery charge was an outlier, a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. "It doesn't make sense," Marcus said during a late-night strategy session in Vance's office. "An officer like Riley, a street cop with a bias problem, doesn't just invent a detailed story about a federal judge taking a bribe over a city contract. That's not his world. That language, that scenario, it had to come from somewhere else. Someone gave it to him." Eleanor Vance agreed. "The anonymous tip," she said, tapping a pen on the thick file of Riley's record. "That's the key. The city is fighting tooth and nail to keep the records of that call under wraps, claiming it's part of an ongoing investigation. But what they're really doing is protecting the source." They decided to focus their legal firepower on that single point of origin. They filed a motion to compel the city to produce all records related to the anonymous tip that led to the arrest, the audio recording of the call, the dispatcher's logs, and most importantly, the call trace information for the number it came from. The city's lawyers fought back with a barrage of legal challenges, delaying and obfuscating at every turn. Their desperate attempts to hide the information only confirmed Vance's suspicion that the tip was the weak point in their defense. After a heated court battle, a federal judge, one of Marcus's own colleagues who had to be brought in from another district to avoid a conflict of interest, ruled in their favor. The city was ordered to turn over the records. When the file arrived, it was almost laughably thin. The audio recording was just 30 seconds of a digitally distorted voice making the bribery allegation. The dispatcher's log was routine, but the call trace report contained the single most important clue they had found so far. The call hadn't come from a landline or a registered cell phone. It had come from a disposable, prepaid burner phone, purchased with cash from a convenience store 2 days before the arrest. It was the kind of phone used by criminals who wanted to avoid being traced. This was the smoking gun they needed. This wasn't a concerned citizen reporting a crime. This was a calculated, premeditated setup. Someone had gone to great lengths to manufacture a false accusation and feed it to a patrol officer they knew would be receptive to it. The investigation had moved beyond the actions of a single racist cop. They were now officially hunting for a conspirator. The discovery of the burner phone transformed the case. It was no longer a civil rights lawsuit about a wrongful arrest. It was now an investigation into a criminal conspiracy. Eleanor Vance knew that tracing a burner phone was notoriously difficult, but not impossible. She brought in a specialist, a digital forensics expert named Jessica Reed, a woman with a reputation for being able to pull actionable intelligence from the thinnest of digital threads. Jessica's first step was to file a new subpoena, this time not to the city, but to the telecommunications company that serviced the burner phone. She requested the cell tower location data for the phone number for the entire 48-hour period it was active, from its purchase until the moment it made the anonymous tip call and was presumably discarded. This data, known as Cell Site Location Information, CSLI, would create a map of the phone's movements, painting a picture of where the conspirator had been. "It's a long shot," Jessica explained to Marcus and Eleanor in their office, pointing to a map of the city on a large screen. "Burner phones are often used by people who know how to cover their tracks. They'll turn it on only for brief periods in crowded areas to avoid creating a clear pattern. But everyone makes mistakes. All we need is one." Days later, the raw data from the telecom company arrived. It was a dense spreadsheet of thousands of data points, timestamps, cell tower IDs, and signal strengths. To the untrained eye, it was gibberish. To Jessica Reed, it was a treasure map. She fed the data into a sophisticated mapping software, and slowly, a digital ghost began to take shape on the screen. As Jessica had predicted, the phone was turned on only sporadically. The first ping showed it being activated near the convenience store where it was purchased, in a busy downtown commercial district. Then it went dark for nearly a day. The next series of pings appeared the evening before the arrest. The phone was active for about 20 minutes, and it was moving, hitting a series of cell towers along the I-95 corridor that circled the city. "They were driving," Jessica said, zooming in on the map, making it harder to pinpoint their exact location. But then she found what she was looking for: a mistake. For a period of about 5 minutes, the phone remained stationary while active, pinging off the same cell tower repeatedly with a strong signal. This meant the user had stopped. Jessica cross-referenced the cell tower's location with a high-resolution satellite map. The tower provided coverage for a small 2-mile radius. That area was mostly industrial warehouses and a stretch of undeveloped riverfront. But nestled right in the middle was a single, notable landmark: a high-end steakhouse called the Capitol Grill. "Interesting," Eleanor mused. "Not the kind of place you'd expect a typical street criminal to be hanging out." The final set of pings came on the morning of the arrest. The phone was activated at 8:45 a.m., just moments before the 911 call was made. It pinged off a single tower, one whose coverage area included a quiet residential park just 3 blocks from Judge Thorne's house. "They were close," Marcus said, a chill running down his spine at the thought of someone watching his home. "They waited until they saw me outside in the garage. Then they made the call." The timeline was now crystal clear. The conspirator bought the phone, scouted the judge's neighborhood, and then made the call from a nearby location while observing him. It was a carefully planned operation. The steakhouse was a tantalizing clue, but it wasn't enough on its own. They needed to connect the phone to a person. "Okay, so they stopped near the Capitol Grill the night before the arrest," Eleanor said, pacing the room. "What else can we get from that?" Jessica's fingers flew across her keyboard. "Let's cross-reference," she said. "We can subpoena the restaurant's reservation list and credit card receipts for that evening, but that could be a dead end. They might have paid cash or not eaten there at all. Let's think bigger. What's around that steakhouse?" She pulled up the satellite map again, scanning the area. The neighborhood was an upscale business district, home to corporate law firms, lobbying groups, and financial institutions. And then she saw it. Directly across the street from the restaurant, sharing the same strong signal from the same cell tower, was a tall glass and steel building. The building that housed the administrative offices for the city's most ambitious and controversial project. It was the headquarters of the Waterfront Development Authority, an organization that fell directly under the control of one man, Mayor Richard Sterling. The room went silent. The digital ghost on the screen was no longer just a random set of coordinates. It was pointing directly at the heart of the city's political power structure. They had found the trail, and it was leading them straight to the mayor's doorstep. The poisonous tip hadn't just come from someone with a grudge. It had come from someone with a profound political and financial stake in the case on Judge Thorne's docket. The connection to the Waterfront Development Authority headquarters was a bombshell. It elevated their suspicions from a vague theory to a concrete line of investigation. But they still needed to connect the burner phone to a specific individual. Proving the phone was merely near a building wasn't enough. They had to prove it was connected to someone inside it. Eleanor Vance knew that a direct subpoena to the mayor's office would be met with a wall of executive privilege claims and legal obstruction. They needed a more subtle approach, a way to get inside without announcing their presence. Jessica Reed proposed a new, audacious strategy. "The building has a public Wi-Fi network for guests," Jessica explained. "It's almost certain that the burner phone, even if it wasn't used for calls, would have been scanning for Wi-Fi networks automatically. If it connected, even for a second, it would leave a digital footprint. We can get a court order for the network's access logs for that specific time window." It was a brilliant legal and technical maneuver. A few days later, with a fresh court order in hand, they received the logs. Jessica began the painstaking process of cross-referencing the millions of entries against the burner phone's unique MAC address, a hardware identifier that is distinct for every device. For hours, she scanned the data, searching for a single match. And then, she found it. At 7:35 p.m. on the night before the arrest, the same night the phone was stationary near the Capitol Grill, the burner phone had connected to the public Wi-Fi network inside the Waterfront Development Authority building. It was the irrefutable link they needed. The conspirator wasn't just near the building, they were inside it. But the logs gave them something even more valuable. Alongside the burner phone's connection, another device had logged on to the same network from the same access point at almost the exact same second. A smartphone registered to a senior policy aide in the mayor's administration. His name was Daniel Miller. "Daniel Miller," Ben Carter, the investigator, said, pulling up a file on his laptop. 32 years old, a rising star in City Hall. He's Mayor Sterling's right-hand man, his chief strategist on the waterfront deal. If the mayor needs something done quietly, Miller's the guy he sends. The pieces were now falling into place with terrifying speed. A top aide to the mayor was in the same place at the same time as the burner phone used to frame a federal judge. It was too precise to be a coincidence. "He's our guy," Eleanor said, her voice grim. "Miller bought the phone, he scouted your house, and he made the call, almost certainly on the mayor's orders. Now that they had a name, Ben Carter could dig deeper. He started pulling Miller's financial records and phone records. He discovered that Miller had a history of handling the mayor's less savory tasks. He was the one who negotiated backroom deals with contractors and silenced political opponents with threats of leaking damaging information. He was the mayor's fixer. The most damning piece of evidence, however, came from an unlikely source. Carter found a disgruntled former employee from the mayor's office, a woman who had been fired by Miller months earlier. Eager for revenge, she was willing to talk. She told Carter that Miller was obsessed with the waterfront project, seeing it as his ticket to a lucrative private sector job. She also told him something that made Marcus Thorne's blood run cold. Miller was terrified of Judge Thorne, the source revealed during a clandestine meeting. He called him the one incorruptible man in the city. He was convinced the judge was going to grant the injunction and kill the project. A few weeks before the arrest, I overheard Miller in a heated conversation with the mayor. The mayor was furious, saying Thorne was a threat that needed to be neutralized. Miller just said, "I'll handle it." There it was: motive, means, and opportunity. They now had a direct line from the anonymous tip through the mayor's top aide, leading straight to Mayor Sterling himself. The conspiracy was no longer a matter of speculation. They had a witness who could place the mayor at the center of the plot. Eleanor Vance knew this was bigger than a civil lawsuit now. A conspiracy to frame a federal judge in order to influence a court case was a serious federal crime. It fell under obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and deprivation of rights under color of law. This was the FBI's jurisdiction. She prepared a detailed summary of their findings: the burner phone trace, the Wi-Fi logs linking the phone to Daniel Miller, and the sworn affidavit from the former employee. She placed it all in a sealed envelope. "Marcus," she said, her expression serious, "we've done all we can as civil attorneys. It's time to hand this over to the federal government. This isn't about money anymore. This is about sending a corrupt mayor to prison." The next morning, the package was delivered by courier to the office of the U.S. Attorney, along with a formal request for a federal criminal investigation into Mayor Richard Sterling and his administration. The mayor had started a fire to create a smokescreen, but now the full, unstoppable force of the federal government was about to be brought down upon him. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The moment the U.S. Attorney's Office received Eleanor Vance's package, the entire landscape of the case shifted. The local scandal instantly became a federal criminal investigation. The FBI, operating with a level of authority and resources that dwarfed the city police department, took the lead. The agents assigned to the case were from the Public Corruption Unit, specialists in untangling complex webs of deceit spun by powerful politicians. For them, Mayor Sterling wasn't a charismatic leader, he was a target. Their first step was to verify the evidence provided by Vance's team. They independently subpoenaed the same cell tower data and Wi-Fi logs, and their forensic experts came to the exact same conclusion. The burner phone used to frame Judge Thorne was undeniably linked to Daniel Miller, the mayor's aide. With this confirmation, they moved swiftly. They obtained a sealed federal warrant to place Daniel Miller under 24/7 surveillance. They tracked his movements, monitored his communications, and began building a comprehensive picture of his life. They were patient, professional, and invisible. The motive, which Marcus and his team had already deduced, was the linchpin of the federal case. The agents delved deep into the waterfront development deal. What they found was a cesspool of corruption that went far beyond mere zoning disputes. The multi-billion-dollar project was a sham, designed to enrich a small circle of the mayor's political donors and cronies. The bidding process had been rigged from the start. A construction firm owned by the mayor's cousin had been secretly guaranteed the primary contract, in exchange for substantial kickbacks funneled into a shell corporation controlled by Sterling himself. Judge Thorne's impending ruling on the injunction was not just a threat to the project, it was an existential threat to the entire criminal enterprise. If the project was halted, It would trigger audits and investigations that would inevitably uncover the rigged bids and the kickback scheme. Sterling wasn't just trying to save a political legacy project, he was trying to stay out of federal prison. Framing the judge wasn't just an act of intimidation, it was an act of pure, desperate self-preservation. The FBI now understood why the accusation had to be bribery. It was a calculated move designed for maximum effect. By accusing Judge Thorne of financial corruption related to a city contract, Sterling hoped to achieve two things. First, he wanted to create a cloud of suspicion around the very man who was about to rule on his own corrupt financial dealings, a classic project and deflect tactic. Second, he hoped the scandal would force the judge to recuse himself from the case, delaying the proceedings and buying him more time to push the development deal past the point of no return. It was a high-risk, high-reward gamble, and it had backfired spectacularly. The final piece of the puzzle for the FBI was Officer Kevin Riley. Was he just a useful idiot, a prejudiced cop who had been easily manipulated? Or was he a willing participant in the conspiracy? They brought him in for questioning. Faced with the cold, methodical interrogation of two seasoned FBI agents, Riley's street cop bravado crumbled. He was no longer dealing with a compliant internal affairs division that would pat him on the back. He was facing federal charges and decades in prison. He tried to stick to his story at first, claiming he acted solely on the anonymous tip and his own suspicions. But the agents presented him with a mountain of evidence. His history of biased policing, the implausibility of his actions, and the clear signs of a setup. Then they played their trump card. "We know about your meeting with Daniel Miller 2 days before the arrest, Kevin," one agent said calmly. They had found security camera footage from a coffee shop 3 blocks from City Hall, showing Riley and Miller sitting at a corner table, deep in conversation. It was the missing link, the proof that the tip wasn't anonymous at all. It had been delivered face-to-face. Riley's face went white. He was trapped. His lawyer, seeing the game was up, advised him to cooperate. Riley's story came tumbling out. Miller had approached him, praising his proactive policing style. He had fed him the story about Judge Thorne, preying on Riley's ambition and his existing prejudices. Miller had told him that Judge Thorne was a dirty cop on the inside, a corrupt official hiding behind his robes, and that taking him down would make Riley a hero. He assured Riley that he would have the full backing of the mayor's office. Riley, blinded by his own biases and the promise of a commendation, had swallowed the story hook, line, and sinker. He was, in the end, exactly what they thought. A pawn. A dangerous and malicious pawn, but a pawn nonetheless. With his confession, the FBI now had everything they needed. They had the mastermind, the fixer, and the muscle. The entire conspiracy was laid bare, from the corrupt motive in the mayor's office to the brutal execution in Judge Thorne's driveway. All that was left was to spring the trap. The moment Kevin Riley's confession was signed and documented, the federal investigation shifted from covert intelligence gathering to overt preparation for prosecution. The U.S. attorney convened a grand jury, and over the next 2 weeks, a parade of witnesses was brought in to testify under oath. FBI agents presented the meticulous evidence they had gathered: the cell phone data, the Wi-Fi logs, the financial records detailing the kickback scheme, the coffee shop surveillance video, and finally the sworn testimony of Officer Riley himself. The grand jury proceedings were conducted in absolute secrecy, a bubble of federal power operating right under the nose of Mayor Sterling, who remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around him. He still believed he was in control. He had seen the headlines about Judge Thorne's lawsuit, but he dismissed it as a civil matter, a financial nuisance that his army of city lawyers would eventually handle. He had successfully silenced Daniel Miller, ordering him to lay low, and he was confident that Riley, the disgraced street cop, would never be able to connect the arrest back to him. He was a mayor, a man insulated by layers of power and plausible deniability. He felt untouchable. His arrogance was his undoing. While Sterling was busy giving speeches about civic unity and police reform, the grand jury was busy handing down a series of sealed indictments. The charges were a laundry list of federal crimes: conspiracy to obstruct justice, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, witness tampering, wire fraud, and money laundering. The targets were clearly named: Officer Kevin Riley, Daniel Miller, and Mayor Richard Sterling. With the indictments secured, the FBI planned the arrests with tactical precision. They decided to execute the warrants simultaneously to prevent any of the targets from tipping off the others. The operation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, a time when all three men would be at their respective places of work, maximizing the public impact of the takedown. For Marcus Thorne, this period was one of quiet anticipation. He had been briefed by the U.S. Attorney and had agreed to put his civil lawsuit on hold pending the outcome of the criminal case. He watched from the sidelines as the federal machine he was a part of moved with a speed and efficiency that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. He felt a profound sense of vindication, but it was mixed with a deep sadness. The system he had dedicated his life to serving had been twisted and weaponized against him by the very people elected to lead it. Justice was coming, but the scars from the battle would remain. On the morning of the arrests, 2 FBI agents paid a visit to Detective Frank Harding at the city precinct. They showed him the sealed indictment for Officer Riley. Harding, the weary veteran who had been the first to recognize the injustice, felt a grim sense of satisfaction. He had been marginalized by his own superiors for questioning the official narrative, but he had held his ground. "He's in the locker room now, getting ready for his shift," Harding told the agents, his voice low. "He's been on desk duty since the incident, hasn't said a word to anyone." The agents nodded. They walked into the locker room and found Kevin Riley lacing up his boots. When he saw the 2 men in dark suits with FBI credentials, the last bit of color drained from his face. "Kevin Riley," one agent said, his voice flat and professional. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct justice." Riley didn't resist. He simply put his hands behind his back, the bravado he had shown in Judge Thorne's driveway completely gone, replaced by the quiet terror of a man whose life was officially over. At the same time, another FBI team entered the Waterfront Development Authority building. They walked into Daniel Miller's office, where the young aide was on the phone, likely orchestrating another part of the mayor's corrupt agenda. When they announced who they were, Miller dropped the phone, his carefully composed demeanor shattering like glass. He knew in that instant that the game was up. The final piece of the operation was the most dramatic. A third team of 6 agents, led by the special agent in charge of the Public Corruption Unit, walked calmly into City Hall. They bypassed the mayor's frantic communications staff, strode down the marble hallway, and entered the opulent mayoral office without knocking. Mayor Richard Sterling was standing by his window, looking out over the city he thought he owned. When he turned and saw the FBI agents, his charismatic smile froze on his face. He had built his kingdom on a foundation of lies, and now the forces of the law had arrived to tear it all down. The ring of federal power had closed around him, and there was no escape. The news of the arrests hit the city like an earthquake. The simultaneous takedowns of a police officer, a top mayoral aide, and the mayor himself sent shockwaves through every level of government and media. The sealed indictments were made public, and for the first time the citizens saw the full, ugly truth. The story was no longer about a single racist cop. It was about a deeply rooted criminal conspiracy orchestrated from the highest office in the city. The connection between Judge Thorne's arrest and the corrupt waterfront deal was laid bare for all to see. In the face of incontrovertible evidence and the prospect of spending the better part of their adult lives in a federal penitentiary, the conspirators' loyalty to each other evaporated. The classic prisoner's dilemma played out exactly as the federal prosecutors had anticipated. The first to cooperate would get the best deal. Daniel Miller, the mayor's ambitious young fixer, was the first to break. He was a political operative, not a hardened criminal. Faced with the mountain of evidence against him, the Wi-Fi logs, the surveillance footage, Riley's confession, he knew he had no viable defense. His high-priced lawyer advised him that his only path to a reduced sentence was to offer his full and complete cooperation. Within 48 hours of his arrest, Miller sat down with prosecutors and told them everything. He detailed Mayor Sterling's obsession with the waterfront project and his growing paranoia about Judge Thorne. He described the meeting where Sterling, in a fit of rage, had ordered him to neutralize the judge. He admitted to concocting the bribery story, buying the burner phone, and recruiting Officer Riley as the perfect pawn for the job. He provided prosecutors with a detailed roadmap of the entire conspiracy, including names, dates, and direct quotes. He even gave them access to a secret cloud server where he had kept copies of incriminating documents related to the kickback scheme, an insurance policy he had created in case the mayor ever tried to betray him. With Miller's confession, the case against Mayor Sterling became airtight. But the prosecutors weren't finished. They then turned their attention to Kevin Riley. They already had his confession about his role in the false arrest, but they wanted more. They wanted him to testify in open court, to sit on the witness stand and tell a jury, in his own words, how he had been manipulated by the mayor's office. In exchange for his testimony against both Miller and Sterling, they offered him a significantly reduced sentence, recommending 5 years in a minimum security prison instead of the maximum of 20. After a brief consultation with his lawyer, Riley agreed. His dream of being a hero cop had died. His only goal now was self-preservation. Mayor Richard Sterling, however, remained defiant. From his jail cell, he maintained his innocence, releasing a statement through his legal team that painted him as the victim of a political witch hunt. He claimed Miller and Riley were disgruntled subordinates who were lying to save their own skins. He postured and blustered, confident that his political influence and the city's best defense attorneys could create enough reasonable doubt to win an acquittal. He still believed he could spin his way out of trouble. His hubris was his final mistake. The U.S. attorney, armed with the full confessions of both of his co-conspirators and the mountain of corroborating physical evidence, decided to make an example of him. They denied him bail, arguing that as the mayor, he had the resources and influence to obstruct justice or flee the jurisdiction. The judge agreed, and Sterling was forced to remain behind bars, stripped of his tailored suits and his power, reduced to the same status as the common criminals he had once governed. The city council, in an emergency session, voted unanimously to suspend him from his duties and appoint an interim mayor. His political career was not just over, it was radioactive. His allies in the business community and the political establishment abandoned him overnight, rushing to distance themselves from the toxic scandal he had created. The entire corrupt structure he had built crumbled in a matter of days. The pressure from the federal investigation had been too great, and the conspiracy, which had seemed so powerful from the inside, proved to be nothing more than a house of cards, collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance and greed. While the legal machinations unfolded, the city itself was in turmoil. The public's reaction to the mayor's arrest was a volatile mix of shock, betrayal, and white-hot anger. The man they had elected on a platform of reform had been exposed as the leader of a criminal enterprise. The waterfront development project, once touted as the city's glittering future, was now seen for what it was, a monument to civic corruption. Trust in the city's leadership was completely shattered. The trial of Richard Sterling was the biggest political spectacle in the city's history. The media descended from all over the country to cover the proceedings. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists, political junkies, and ordinary citizens who wanted to see justice done with their own eyes. The prosecution, led by a calm and methodical assistant U.S. attorney, laid out its case with devastating precision. They started with the video of Judge Thorne's arrest, replaying the raw humiliation for the jury to see. Then, they brought Officer Kevin Riley to the stand. In a quiet, defeated voice, Riley recounted how Daniel Miller had preyed on his ambition and prejudice, feeding him the fabricated bribery story and assuring him of the mayor's support. Next came Daniel Miller himself. Poised and articulate, he walked the jury through the entire conspiracy, from the initial planning stages in the mayor's office to the execution of the anonymous tip. He presented emails and text messages that corroborated his account, painting a chilling picture of a mayor obsessed with power and willing to destroy an innocent man's life to protect his corrupt dealings. The defense attorneys did their best to discredit the witnesses, painting Miller and Riley as unreliable liars trying to save themselves. But their arguments fell flat against the weight of the physical evidence. The FBI agents testified about the burner phone trace, the Wi-Fi logs, and the financial records that proved the kickback scheme. The most powerful moment of the trial, however, came when Judge Marcus Thorne took the stand. He was not there as a victim seeking pity, but as a witness for the prosecution, a symbol of the rule of law that Sterling had tried to subvert. In a calm, measured voice, he described the events of that Saturday morning. He spoke not of his anger, but of his profound disappointment that the systems of justice could be so easily twisted for personal gain. He told the jury, "The moment Officer Riley placed those handcuffs on my wrists, he was not just arresting a man, he was attempting to arrest the very idea of impartial justice itself. He was acting on the orders of a man who believed he was above the law. In this country, no one is above the law." His testimony was simple, powerful, and utterly devastating to the defense. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for less than 4 hours. The foreman stood and read the verdict, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom. On all counts, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, wire fraud, the verdict was the same: guilty. Richard Sterling, the once invincible mayor, sat stone-faced as his fate was sealed. He showed no emotion as the judge ordered him to be taken into custody immediately to await sentencing. The charismatic smile was gone, replaced by the blank stare of a man who had lost everything. The fallout from the verdict was immediate and sweeping. The corrupt waterfront development deal was canceled. The construction firm owned by the mayor's cousin filed for bankruptcy. Several city officials implicated in the scheme resigned in disgrace. The city council, under the leadership of the interim mayor, began a painful but necessary process of reckoning. They initiated a top-to-bottom review of the police department, finally agreeing to implement a civilian oversight board and mandatory body cameras, reforms that Sterling had blocked for years. The city paid Judge Thorne the $900,000 settlement he had previously rejected, this time with no strings attached, accompanied by a public, deeply personal apology delivered on the steps of City Hall. But for Marcus, the victory was never about the money. It was about the truth. It was about reaffirming the principle that had guided his entire life, that justice must apply to all, regardless of their power or position. The city had been wounded, its trust broken, but through the crucible of the scandal, it was being forced to rebuild itself on a stronger, more honest foundation. The reckoning had been painful, but it was the only way to heal. In the months following the trial, a fragile sense of order began to return to the city. Richard Sterling was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, a stern message from the court that abuse of public trust would be met with severe consequences. Daniel Miller received a 3-year sentence in exchange for his cooperation, while Kevin Riley was sentenced to 5 years, his career in law enforcement ending in the ultimate disgrace of a prison jumpsuit. The wheels of justice, though slow and arduous, had ground to a decisive conclusion. The city embarked on its promised path of reform, appointing a new reform-minded police chief and establishing robust oversight committees. The name Sterling became a cautionary tale, a synonym for the insidious nature of corruption that can fester behind a charismatic smile. For Judge Marcus Thorne, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The news vans eventually left his street, and his neighbors, who had once been horrified witnesses, became a tight-knit network of support. He returned to the bench, his reputation not just restored, but enhanced. He was no longer just a respected judge. He was a symbol of integrity, a man who had faced down the city's most powerful figure and won. Yet the victory was not without its cost. The scars from that Saturday morning remained. Sometimes, when working on his Mustang in the quiet of his garage, the sound of a car pulling into his driveway too quickly would cause his heart to leap into his throat. The sense of absolute safety in his own home had been violated, a wound that time could dull but never completely erase. He now looked at the world with a sadder, wiser gaze, forever aware of the fragility of the institutions he held dear. He had won the war, but the memory of the ambush would be with him always. The story of Richard Sterling is a classic study in narcissistic ambition. His downfall began not with a single corrupt act, but with the foundational belief that the rules that applied to others did not apply to him. What could lead a man with so much power and public adoration to risk everything? It was a toxic cocktail of arrogance and desperation. He saw the waterfront project not as a public service, but as his personal legacy, a monument to his own perceived greatness. Judge Thorne wasn't a person to him, he was an obstacle, an impersonal problem to be neutralized. Sterling's fatal flaw was his inability to conceive of a world where his will could be denied. He believed his power made him immune to consequences, a delusion that ultimately led him to a federal prison cell. Could Marcus Thorne have done anything differently that morning to protect himself better? Perhaps. If he had immediately started recording with his own phone, it might have given Riley a moment's pause. If he had shouted for his wife to call 911 and report a rogue officer, it might have brought a supervisor to the scene more quickly. But to dwell on such hypotheticals is to miss the fundamental point. The burden of de-escalation should never fall on the victim of a rights violation. Judge Thorne acted with a composure and dignity that most could not have mustered. His adherence to his principles, even while being stripped of his liberty, was his ultimate weapon. He should not have had to do anything differently. The system around him should have been better. This story, born from a quiet morning and a malicious lie, teaches us a profound lesson about power and accountability. It reminds us that corruption often wears a friendly, respectable mask, and that the most dangerous threats to justice don't always come from the barrel of a gun, but from the stroke of a pen in a quiet, powerful office. It shows that, while the arc of the moral universe is long, it can be bent toward justice by the courage of ordinary people. A neighbor with a smartphone, an employee who dares to speak out, and a man who refuses to let his integrity be bought for any price. What do you think is the most effective way to hold powerful people accountable? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone stood up to an abuse of power? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and insights are what build a community that refuses to stay silent.